Welcome to Sleepy Classic Tales. Today we're telling The Damned Thing by Ambrose Bierce, published in the year 1893. In a log cabin in the mountains lies a dead man, and 8 men have gathered to find out what he died of. But the answer stands in no textbook of forensic medicine. A story about what lives between heaven and earth and has no color for our eyes. Make yourself comfortable, breathe calmly, and let yourself be carried into a moonlit night in the mountains of California. By the light of a tallow candle standing on a rough wooden table, a man sat reading in a book. It was an old, worn account book, and the handwriting in it was evidently not easy to decipher, for the man sometimes held the pages close to the flame so that the light ran yellow over his gaunt face. He was the coroner of the district, and the book in which he read had been found with the dead man. The dead man lay in the same room, on a plank table against the wall, a cloth over the body. It was a log cabin, a single room, such as hunters and settlers build themselves in the mountains, and through the open window the night came in. The smell of the forests, the chirping out of the dark, and far off, from the heights, sometimes the sound of an animal one could not name. Around the walls of the cabin sat and leaned 8 men. They were farmers and woodcutters from the region, called in as a jury, weather-beaten people with grave, patient faces, and they were silent. No one in this assembly spoke an unnecessary word. They were waiting for the witness. He came late. Outside hoofbeats approached. Then a young man entered the cabin, greeted the company, and stood a moment at the door as though he had to collect himself. He was different from the men at the walls, dressed like a city man, dusty from riding, a writer from San Francisco, as would appear, and he had a long way behind him to testify here. His name was William Harker. He had seen the man under the cloth die. The coroner shut the book and put it into his coat pocket, and one of the jurors asked what kind of book that was. It had belonged to the dead man, the coroner said only, a diary, and it did not belong to the matter. Then he called up the witness, had him swear to tell the truth, and asked him to report in his own words and from the beginning what he knew about the death of the man who lay there against the wall. The young man sat down, looked a moment over at the shrouded body, and began. The dead man's name was Hugh Morgan, and he had been his friend. Harker told it calmly, like one who has arranged his words on a long ride. He had come up from the city weeks ago to visit Morgan. They had known each other for years, and to accompany him at hunting and fishing. He had, besides, had the plan of studying his friend's solitary life, for he wrote stories, and Morgan had always been a riddle to him. An educated man who had turned his back on the world and lived up here alone, with dog and rifle. But already in the first days he had noticed that something was not right with his friend. Morgan slept badly. He bolted door and shutter at night, which no one did in these mountains, and sometimes he broke off in the middle of a sentence at a meal and listened, his head tilted for sounds Harker did not hear. Once, at dusk, Harker saw him standing outside, his rifle half raised, his gaze fixed on the empty field before the cabin, where there was nothing but grass in the evening wind. To questions, Morgan answered evasively. He spoke of an animal that was spoiling the region for him, a mountain lion, perhaps, he said, or something of the sort. But he said it in a tone that did not believe its own explanation. Now on that morning, the morning of the death, they had set out before sunrise, the shotguns over their shoulders, to hunt quail. The way led over a wide clearing, a field of wild oats, chest high, which lay perfectly still in the first gray light. Not a breath of wind stirred. And then, In the midst of walking, Morgan stopped. He looked to the right, over the field, and slowly raised his gun. Harker followed his gaze. And then he saw it too. In the still oats, 30, 40 paces away, something was moving. The stalks bent down in a track. A broad trail laid itself through the field, as when a heavy body passes through, evenly, purposefully. And it came toward the two men. But over the track there was nothing. No animal, no body, no shadow. Only the oats that lay down and rose again, step by step nearer, and the soft, heavy rushing of trodden stalks in the windless air. Harker told the jurors he had at first believed it a trick of the senses, a gust of wind running over the field. But wind presses the grass down in waves, fleeting and broad. This was no wave. This was a trail that came into being while one watched. And what drew it was not to be seen. And it came nearer, and the dog that was with them pressed whining against Morgan's leg, and then, its tail tucked in, it fled. Harker told more slowly, and in the cabin no one stirred. The trail in the oats, he said, had still been about 20 paces off when Morgan jerked the gun to his cheek and screamed. A scream Harker would never forget. "The damn thing! There it is again!" And then he fired, both barrels, straight into the wandering track. The smoke of the shots stood a breath long in the still air, and out of this smoke it happened. A sound came over the field such as Harker could assign to no animal, a wild, choking bellow without direction, and Morgan was torn off his feet. Harker saw it, and he swore before the jurors that he had been of clear mind. His friend lay on the ground and fought. He fought with something that was not there. His body was thrown to and fro, dragged, turned. His fists struck into the void and yet hit something. His gun flew aside, and around the two of them, around Morgan and around the nothing, the oats broke and bent in a wide circle, as though a heavy struggle of two bodies raged there. And the whole time, Morgan screamed. Screams of rage first, then others. Harker confessed openly what he had done and not done. He had rushed toward the struggle, but had not dared to shoot for fear of hitting his friend, and halfway there he had stumbled and fallen, and when he was on his feet again, it had been still. Perfectly still. The oats lay trampled in a wide, tangled circle, and in its midst lay Morgan, face down, and stirred no more. But all around, Harker looked about him as he said it, as though he still saw the field before him. All around, no trail ran any longer through the oats. Whatever had been there, it was gone. Or it stood still. Or it stood beside him. That was the most dreadful thing, he said, this not knowing. This field that looked again like any field in the world. He knelt down beside his friend. Morgan was no longer alive, or he was dying in those moments. His coat was torn to shreds, and the wounds Harker saw he described to the jurors with a faltering voice. Marks as of an enormous grip, the flesh crushed and torn, the throat badly mangled, as though a monstrous weight had seized there. He had finally turned the dead man onto his back, Harker said softly, and seen the face. And the face of his friend, which he knew from years of friendship, had worn in death an expression he would not dare to describe in any story he might ever write. The expression of a person who is looking at something that no person should look at. When Harker had ended, it was long silent in the cabin. The candle crackled, outside the night chirped, and the 8 men at the walls looked at the ground or at their hands. and none looked over at the table on which the dead man lay. Then the coroner rose. It was part of the jury's duty, he said, to view the body, and he stepped to the table and threw back the cloth. The men stood up, one after another, and stepped closer, reluctantly, as men do a duty they dread. What they saw, Bierce described with the coldness of the record, and I give it with due restraint. The dead Hugh Morgan had been a large, powerful man, and what of him lay on the boards showed that he had fought his last fight with all his strength, and that this strength had counted for nothing. The injuries were such as no beast of prey of the mountains leaves, no bite, no claw tear, but the work of a monstrous, formless grip. The jurors looked at it in silence and went back to their places. The coroner questioned Harker once more, and now there came into the proceedings that tone which such proceedings take when what is heard does not fit into the world of reason. Whether the witness held to it that he had seen no animal, Harker held to it. Whether it could not have been a mountain lion hidden in the high oats. The oats were chest-high, Harker said, but he had seen the trail in the field, from above, as a whole. What drew it, he would have had to see. Whether the witness had drunk with the deceased the evening before, Harker denied it calmly. Whether the witness was a writer, one of the jurors asked, and whether he invented stories by profession. Harker looked at the man and said, yes, that was his profession, and he wished to God he had invented this one. The coroner asked last whether the witness had anything to add to the proceedings. Then Harker stood up, and one could see that he was wrestling with himself. He knew, he said, how his testimony sounded, and he knew what had been said in the district about the dead man, that Morgan had grown odd, that he lived alone and hunted ghosts. But there was a testimony that knew more than he himself. The coroner possessed it. It lay in his coat pocket. Morgan's diary. The coroner replied without changing his expression that the book did not belong to the matter. What a man confided to his lonely nights was no piece of evidence. The jurors were sent outside to deliberate before the door under the stars. They did not stay long. Their verdict, which the eldest farmer read out, ran in the gnarled spelling of these mountains roughly so. The jury finds that the deceased came to his death by a mountain lion. Some of us, nonetheless, are of the opinion that he had the falling sickness, or fits. So the inquest ended by rights, and had this remained a hearing, the story would end here. But Bierce lets us read on, where the court closes the file, in the book that the coroner kept in his coat pocket, and that, it is said, he probably did read later, after all. Hugh Morgan's diary. And with this diary, we now step back into the cabin, into the weeks before the death, and hear the dead man himself. The entries begin harmlessly and grow darker step by step. First, one notes the doings of the hermit's life, hunting, weather, supplies, and then, one night, an incident with the dog. The dog had given the alarm, Morgan writes, furious and then whining, and when he went out with the lantern, nothing was to be found. But in the dew-wet grass before the cabin, there had stood a fresh trail, broad, deep impressions, from no animal he knew. And they ended in the middle of the field, as though what trod them had dissolved into air, or had... Here the sentence breaks off. A few days later, the stars. Morgan describes how he stood at the window at night and saw the stars over the mountain ridge, and how a row of them went out and shone again, one after another from left to right, as though something were pushing itself between him and the sky, something with outline and size that one did not see, but recognized only by what it covered. No drift of cloud, he writes. The night was clear. It went over the ridge, and the stars came out again behind it. Then the birds. How in the middle of the day over the slope the twittering went out, not gradually, but at a stroke, in an arc, as though a silence were running through the trees, like a bow wave before something that travels. And the dog. The dog, Morgan writes, could no longer be held. One morning it was gone, and it did not come back. Between these observations stand the sentences of a man who fears for his reason, and for that very reason holds it fast with both hands. I am not mad, he writes. I have tested what is to be tested. It is no dream. I have been awake and seen. It comes nearer than before. It circles the cabin. I will not go away. Underlined. For if I go away, I grant it that it can drive me off, and then more belongs to it than this mountain. And then, toward the end, that entry in which the lonely man attacks his fear with the only tool left to him, thinking. He will no longer ask whether the thing exists. He will ask what it is, and what it means that a thing can exist that healthy eyes cannot see. The entry in which Hugh Morgan finds his answer begins with the ear and ends at the eye. There are sounds, he writes, that no human being hears. At the very top and the very bottom of the scale lie ranges in which the air vibrates, and yet for us is silence. The whistle to which a dog reacts and which its master does not perceive. The deep tone at which our chest vibrates without our hearing anything. No one would claim that these sounds do not exist. We say they lie outside our ear. And then Morgan takes the step around which his whole last week must have turned. What holds for the ear holds for the eye. Light, too, is a vibration. Colors, too, are a scale. And this scale, too, reaches beyond our senses, at both ends. There are colors we cannot see. Not because they are dark, not because they are hidden, but because our eye has no instrument for them, as little as our ear for the tone of the dog whistle. The rainbow, we know, is only the section of a much greater one, whose edges do not exist for us. And if there are colors we cannot see, then there can be things that bear these colors. A being, written in a color outside our rainbow, would be invisible to us and would yet be there. It would have weight. It would tread grass down. It would cover stars. It would throw the birds into silence. The dog would smell it and flee. It would be no ghost. It would be an animal of this earth, real, breathing, hungry, dangerous. Only one that our eye is not equal to. And then Morgan writes the sentence toward which everything runs, and one reads in him the relief of having found at last a thought into which the horror fits. We do not hear everything. We do not see everything. And if such a being found me, who would believe me? The last entries are short. He notes that it is near almost every night, that he no longer sleeps, that for 2 days he watched the field and followed the tracks in the oats, that he leaves the rifle standing loaded at the door. And then, in a different hand and written more hastily, a single sentence, probably in the night before that morning. Harker is coming along on the hunt. Perhaps it is good that someone is there. Perhaps a second person will see what I see. With that, the book ends. What came afterward, William Harker had told in the cabin before 8 silent men. So the two testimonies stand side by side, and the story leaves us alone with them. There is the verdict of the jury, a mountain lion, and if not that, then Fitz, the answer of the world, which must go on living, and therefore puts everything into a drawer into which it, more or less, fits. These men were no fools. They had seen the dead man and knew as well as Harker that no mountain lion leaves such marks. But they had farms and children and paths that led at night through the same forests, and they needed a name one can live with. And there is Morgan's diary, which did not belong to the matter. The answer of a man who had nothing more to lose and could therefore think to the end. No ghost, no demon, no punishment of heaven, but a creature of flesh that lives in a color for which our eye is blind. Sober, almost scientific, and for that very reason, cold to the bone. For a ghost, one can pray away. An animal one cannot see is simply there, in the oats, before the window. Now. Bierce does not decide between the two answers, and he does not tell us either what Hugh Morgan saw at the last in that expression which Harker would not describe in any story. He leaves us only with the thought that the lonely man wrote in his account book. And this thought is no invention. Our senses are a narrow window. What we call reality is the section of it that we can see. Whoever hears the dog whistle that is silent for us knows that beyond the edge something else begins, and the edge lies nearer than we like. The candle in the log cabin had burned down when the men parted. They rode off in different directions, each to his farm, through the grass of the clearings and under the trees, and the night was clear and full of stars over the mountains of California. And perhaps one or another of them looked up on the way to the ridge and watched how the stars stood there, calm and unchanged, a whole long while, until he scolded himself and rode on and resolved to believe in a mountain lion. That was our short retelling of The Damned Thing by Ambrose Bierce. A man dies of something no one can see and leaves behind, instead of an explanation, a thought. That our eyes and ears capture only a section of the world. What lies outside is not for that reason less real. It is only silent and colorless for us. Good night. And if you like, we'll hear each other again tomorrow at Sleepy Classic Tales.